have already said that we've come to a dangerous line, and calls of the West to deliver strategic defeat to Russia, a country with the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons, shows extreme adventurism of the Western politicians. At least some of them. Such blind faith in their own impunity and exceptionalism might turn to a global tragedy. At the same time, the previous hegemons used to ruling the world back from colonial times learn, and more often to their surprise, that no one is listening to them. The attempts to maintain the power slipping away through force only leads to overall instability and greater tensions, to casualties and destruction, but the result that they're trying to achieve, to maintain their absolute power, such attempts do not ensure success, because the course of history cannot be stopped. Instead of becoming aware of futility of their strive, the objective nature of changes, some of the Western elites are prepared to do everything not to allow for emergence of new international system in line with the interests of the world majority. The policy of the US and their allies in the past years is more and more prominent through the principle, if I can't have it, no one will. If you're not with us, you're against us. Well, this formula is very dangerous. Because here and in many countries of the world, there is such a saying that you reap what you sow. The chaos and systemic crisis is already in full swing in those countries that are trying to conduct such a policy. The claims to being exceptional, to being liberal and globalist messiahs, to ideological and military and political monopoly, are depleting those countries more and more that are trying to conduct this policy and pushing the world towards deterioration. It comes in direct contradiction with the true interests of the nations of the US and European countries. I'm sure that sooner or later the West will understand that, because the foundation of its former great achievements was always the pragmatic and sober approach, based on very harsh and at times cynical but rational evaluation of what's happening in their own capacities. And here I'd like to highlight once again, unlike our opponents, Russia does not perceive the Western civilization as an enemy. It does not raise the question, us or them. Who's not with us, he's against us. We never say that. We don't want to pontificate to anyone. We don't want to impose our worldview on anyone. Our position is an open one, and it's the following. The West has accumulated indeed tremendous human, intellectual, cultural, and material resources, thanks to which it can successfully develop, remaining one of the crucial elements of the world system. But it is precisely one of, together with other actively developing countries and states and groups of countries, the notion of hegemony in the new international sphere is off the table. And when Washington and other Western capitals become aware of that and recognize this cold hard fact, then the process of building of the global system in line with the challenges of the future will finally enter the phase of true constructive building. I hope to God that it will happen as soon as possible. It is in common interests. Also in the interest, and first and foremost, in the interest of the West. As of now, everyone who is interested in the creation of a just and viable world have to spend too much effort on overcoming the destructive actions of the West, clinging to their own monopoly. It's apparent that it's happening, and everyone can see that. In the West, in the East, in the South, and everywhere. They're trying to keep their power and monopoly. These are apparent things. These efforts could have been directed with much greater use and result to solving common problems that indeed concern everyone. Demographic problems, social inequality, climate change, food security, healthcare, new technologies. That's what we could think about it. What we all truly need to work on. Today, I will allow myself several philosophical asides, since this is a discussion club. Then I hope that will follow in the vein of the discussions that were happening here before. I have already said that the world is changing drastically and irreversibly. It is unlike the previous version of world order. Due to the combination of parallel coexistence of two seemingly mutually exclusive phenomena, a fast, rapidly growing conflict potential and fragmentation of political, economic and legal field on the one hand, and the maintaining close interconnectedness of the whole world space on the other hand, it can be perceived as counterintuitive because we're used to the fact that such trends usually follow one another and substitute one another. Century after century, the times of conflict and breaking off ties are replaced by more beneficial periods of cooperation. That is the dynamic of development of history. It seems that it doesn't work today. But let's start to maybe have a bit of a discussion about it. Most acute and principled, emotionally charged conflicts naturally significantly complicate the global development but did not put an end to it. Instead of chains of cooperation destroyed by political means and even military means, appear another, more complex, sometimes less linear, but they maintain economic and social ties. We have seen that in the previous years. Quite recently, the so-called collective West made an unprecedented attempt to banish Russia from the global system of economic and political system. The number of sanctions and punitive measures against our country is unprecedented in history. Our opponents assumed that they would deliver to Russia a devastating blow and knockout, something that it would not bounce back from. It would stop being one of key elements of international system. I think there is no need to remind you of what happened in reality. The very fact that the anniversary edition of Valdai Club has gathered such a representative audience speaks for itself. Well, it's not a matter about Valdai, it's about the reality that we're living in right now, and in which the conditions which Russia lives in, and the world needs Russia, and no decisions by Washington or Brussels' alleged masters cannot change it. The same applies to their other decisions. Even a well-trained swimmer cannot swim across to a strong current, regardless of tricks and doping that it uses. As for the global policy and the current it is taking, it's contrary to the strives of the West, from the outgoing hegemonic world to the upcoming diversity. This is an apparent thing. As we say, well, it doesn't take a smart man to say it. Let's go back to the dialectics of history and change of era of conflict and cooperation. Is indeed the world such that this theory does not work in practice? Let's take a look at what's happening today at a different angle. What is the essence of the conflict and who's taking part in it? Since the mid-past century, when through joint effort and a tremendous price, it was possible to overcome Nazism, the most nefarious and aggressive ideology that was the fruit of most acute contradictions of the first half of the 20th century. The humanity was faced with a task to avoid the repetition of such phenomenon and the world wars. Despite all zigzags and local skirmishes, the overall direction was defined back then. That is, the radical rejection of all forms of racism, dismantling of the classical colonial system, and expansion to the number of fully fledged members of international politics. The demand for openness and democratization of the international system, it was apparent. The fast development of different countries and regions, emergence of new technological and socio-economic approaches aimed at expansion of capacity for development and improved life standards. Naturally, just like any historic process, that led to emergence of a clash of interest, but overall strive towards harmonization of development of all aspects of this phenomena was readily apparent. Our country, back in the day it was the Soviet Union, made a tremendous contribution to the strengthening of this trend. The USSR was helping the states liberated from colonial or neo-colonial dependence, be that Africa, Southeast Asia, Middle East or Latin America. And I'd like to remind you separately that it was the Soviet Union that in the mid-80s of the past century advocated for the end of ideological confrontation and overcoming the heritage of the Cold War, the end of the Cold War per se, and later overcoming its heritage and those barriers that stood in the way of the unity of the world and its comprehensive development. Yes, we have a complex attitude to that period, considering what it has come to, the policy of the then political leadership of the country. We still have to manage some of the tragic consequences of those times, but the very sentiment, I'd like to highlight the sentiment, though possibly too idealistic, coming from our leadership and our nation, at times naive, as we can see today, without doubt was dictated by the genuine desire for peace and comprehensive benefit. That is historically typical for the nature of our nation and its traditions and the systems of spiritual and moral values.